Thanksgiving had always been loud in my family, a kind of holiday that filled every room with noise. Pans clattering in the kitchen, cousins arguing in the living room, uncles laughing too loudly at jokes they'd told for years. But that night, even before the first plate hit the table, I could tell something was different. There was a heaviness in the air that didn't match the season, a kind of tightness in the smiles, a flicker in the way people looked at me and quickly looked away. It felt like stepping into a room where a conversation had just ended, one I wasn't invited to hear. The house was glowing, though not with warmth, but with the careful, curated shine my mother always loved to polish into existence. The candles flickered in their gold holders, the table stretched longer than any reasonable family needed, each plate aligned like it belonged in a catalog photo. It was beautiful in the way things are when they are arranged, not lived in. And as always, my seat, second from the end, slightly outside the heart of the table, waited quietly for me. I doubt anyone noticed that I'd slipped in. Jenna noticed herself, though. She always did. She swept across the room in an emerald dress that shimmered every time she turned, laughing brightly, adjusting napkins already perfectly placed, smoothing her hair with the certainty of someone who believed the whole evening revolved around her. Mom trailed behind her with that soft, glowing admiration she had reserved only for Jenna since we were children. Dad moved with a different energy, though more clipped, more tense, his steps quick and his eyes darting away each time they landed on me. It wasn't the normal distracted holiday rush. It was avoidance. And the more I watched him sidestep my gaze, the more I recognized the kind of nervousness that comes from secrets, not the small family kind, the big ones that shift the ground when they're spoken aloud. I had learned early that my place in the family wasn't the center. It wasn't even close. While Jenna grew up surrounded by applause, dance classes, cheerleading teams, the best camps money could buy, I grew up surrounded by responsibility. They said I was steady, the daughter who didn't need checking on, the one who could heat her own dinner, handle her own homework, soothe herself to sleep. It was less a compliment, more a convenience. If Jenna was a delicate plant they believed needed constant watering, I was the rock they placed beside it, useful, stable, unnoticed. I didn't resent her for it. Not then. I simply learned to live in the quiet spaces she never entered. The only person who ever broke that silence for me was my grandmother, Evelyn. Silver hair pinned in soft curls, eyes that saw more than she ever said aloud. She would pull me into small conversations by the window, press her cool hand gently over mine and whisper, "You're stronger than they think. Don't forget that." She didn't say it loudly, but the truth rarely needs volume. Her words stayed with me longer than any applause Jenna ever collected. But this Thanksgiving, this particular night, felt like a stage waiting for a performance I hadn't auditioned for. Every relative who arrived gave me a smile that didn't meet their eyes. Conversations dipped when I entered the room and bloomed again when I stepped out. The energy wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was rehearsed. And when I noticed that the chair usually placed beside mine had been removed entirely, not shifted or moved aside but removed, something cold settled in my stomach. It wasn't the missing chair itself, it was the intention behind it. A quiet erasure, subtle but unmistakable. Dinner began in that same tension, everyone pretending the air wasn't humming with anticipation. And then Jenna tapped her wine glass. The sound sliced through the room like a cue. Every conversation fell silent. Every head turned. She stood there under the soft glow of the chandelier, radiant, poised, practically trembling with excitement she could barely contain. She held the moment the way someone holds a secret they are desperate to release. "I have an announcement," she said, letting the suspense stretch a second too long. Mom's smile deepened, clasping her hands as if she were witnessing something sacred. Dad's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering near his temple. Aunts leaned forward. Cousins straightened. Even Grandma Evelyn pressed her fingertips to the table as if steadying herself. And then Jenna said it loud, clear, confident, certain the world would celebrate with her. "Mom and Dad are signing the house to me." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes glowing, her chest rising with pride. "Emily gets nothing." The reaction was instant. Cheers, claps, whistles from the far end of the table. Someone actually slapped Dad on the back, as if he had accomplished something impressive. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eye like she was witnessing a graduation. Even the cousins who barely spoke to me nodded in approval, a silent chorus agreeing that this was exactly the way things should be. I didn't clap. I didn't blink. I simply sat there upright, hands still, watching the room celebrate a decision they believed was final. Inside me there was no shock. No sting. Just a kind of clarity that settles deep, cold, deliberate, certain. Because as I watched my sister bask in the applause, I remembered something so vividly it felt like I was watching it unfold again. Her voice ringing across the table as she announced that she alone would receive the house, the cheers that erupted around her, and the moment when I simply smiled and asked my father, "Should I tell them or will you?" That memory wasn't fading. It was sharpening. Jenna turned to me with a sweet, triumphant smile, the look of someone who believed they had won something valuable. She expected me to shrink, to stay quiet, to accept my place the way I always had. But instead I placed my fork gently on my plate. Dad froze. His face drained of color. And without raising my voice, without leaning forward, without any theatrics, I let the calm truth slip out of me like a blade sliding cleanly from its sheath. "Dad," I said, "should I tell them or will you?" The room broke. Cheers fell into silence. A wine glass stopped midair. Mom's smile twitched before collapsing. Jenna's expression cracked open, fear flickering into the edges of her eyes. Every relative leaned in, not eagerly but instinctively, sensing the shift in temperature. Dad didn't speak. He didn't deny it. He didn't look at Jenna. He simply stared at the table, his breath shallow, his guilt a visible thing. And in that silence, everyone at the table understood one thing. The announcement Jenna made wasn't the beginning of celebration. It was the beginning of something unraveling. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Because the house wasn't a reward. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a legacy. It was a secret. And I was done being quiet long before the Thanksgiving table fell silent. Long before Jenna's proud smile cracked under the weight of a truth she didn't know she was holding. There were signs. Small ones, quiet ones, the kind you only recognize when distance sharpens your vision. Families like mine don't break in the moment the announcement is made. They break slowly over years in the choices people pretend aren't choices at all. And the story that led us to that dinner didn't begin with Jenna's toast. It began months earlier, in places no one else had been paying attention to. It began in our childhood, in the patterns we grew up absorbing without ever naming them. Patterns that shaped how each of us learned to speak, listen, survive, and stay quiet when silence was easier than honesty. I grew up knowing that in our house, attention wasn't evenly distributed. It flowed like water in a garden, directed carefully toward the plant that was considered delicate, special, deserving of nurturing. And that plant had always been Jenna. She didn't ask to be adored. She simply existed in a space where everyone assumed she needed it. If she cried, Mom came running. If she struggled, Dad softened instantly. If she wanted something, the world rearranged itself so she could have it. Meanwhile, I learned early that I was not the kind of daughter people rushed toward. I was steady. Their favorite word to describe me. A word that tasted like responsibility disguised as praise. Steady meant I didn't need help. Steady meant I wouldn't complain. Steady meant I was the daughter they could overlook without guilt. And I learned to wear that steadiness like armor, not because it made me strong, but because I didn't know I was allowed to be anything else. My grandmother Evelyn was the only exception. She had a way of seeing through performances, through noise, through all the little dynamics everyone else pretended not to notice. When she looked at me, there was no comparison, no disappointment, no expectation that I should be anything other than myself. She used to touch the side of my face gently and say, "You see things clearly, Emily. Don't let anyone talk you out of what you already know." At the time I thought she meant I had good instincts. Now I know she meant I had the courage to face truths my parents spent their lives trying to avoid. That courage is what kept me steady the day Mom called in June, asking me to come home because they needed me for something important. There wasn't urgency in her voice, just the practiced sweetness she used whenever she wanted something from me. When I arrived, they seated me at the same dining table where everything would later crumble. Mom placed her hand over mine and smiled too tightly, while Dad pushed a folder toward me with a seriousness I didn't understand yet. They told me they were refinancing the house. Just a quick signature, they said. Just routine. Just paperwork. And there, tucked in the middle of those reassurances, was the truth they were hoping I wouldn't see. They needed me to take responsibility for their growing mistakes. As I opened the folder, the weight in my chest grew heavier with every page. There were blacked out numbers, payments that didn't add up, missing documents that should have been there. Questions rose in my mind faster than the answers could form. When I asked if I could take the papers with me and have my lawyer look them over, both of them froze. Dad snapped the folder shut too quickly, his Adam's apple tightening as he swallowed. Mom's face lost its false ease. And in the silence that followed, I heard everything they didn't say. I took the folder with me anyway. Back in Chicago, I dropped it on my lawyer's desk, pretending to be calm. She spent half an hour flipping through the pages, her eyebrows tightening slightly each time she uncovered something that didn't belong. When she finally looked up at me, the expression on her face made my stomach twist. "This isn't a refinance," she said. "It's a transfer of liability. If you sign this, you become responsible for their debt." I remember gripping the arm of the chair, feeling the ground tilt beneath me. "What debt?" I asked, though the answer was already written across her expression. She explained it carefully. A second mortgage, missed payments, fees piling up, foreclosure warnings. All the things my parents had never mentioned, not once. Not in all those holiday calls or casual texts where they asked about my job or sent photos of the garden blooming in spring. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the debt, but because of the betrayal. I kept hearing my mother's voice saying I was steady, hearing all the ways that word had been used to soothe their guilt as they gave everything to Jenna and nothing to me. They weren't asking me for help. They were transferring the consequences of their silence onto my name. They were slipping a burden into my hands the way you hand someone a gift bag, hoping they won't open it until they're too far away to hand it back. 2 months later, Dad called again, this time asking for money directly without excuses, at least not at first. He started with for Mom's medication, but when I offered to pay the hospital instead, his voice cracked. The truth leaked out in pieces. Missed bills, collection agencies, deadlines, panic. It wasn't a new crisis. It was a long-burning one. And because I was the strong one, they assumed they had the right to hand it to me. Still, even then, I didn't say anything to Jenna. Not because she deserved the illusion, but because I didn't think she had ever been offered anything else. She lived in a world built on carefully crafted stories. Stories my parents had edited, so she never had to face how fragile their stability really was. I wasn't protecting her as much as I was giving myself time to understand what role they wanted me to play. But the truth has a way of showing itself even when no one speaks it aloud. A few weeks after Dad's call, Jenna's social media posts changed. She started posting photos on the front porch, smiling as if she belonged to the house already. Captions about exciting changes coming, and big plans ahead. She even posted a photo of the living room with a heart emoji. It didn't take more than 2 posts for me to understand what my parents had done. They replaced me. If I wouldn't carry their burden, Jenna would. Not because she was prepared, but because she was available. Because she was predictable. Because she was easier to manipulate. And because she had no idea how fragile the floor beneath her really was. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the truth inside me had solidified into something unmovable. I didn't walk into that house blindly. I walked in knowing that everyone in that room had been told a version of the story that left me conveniently out of it. And even before Jenna tapped her glass, even before those words left her mouth, Mom and Dad are signing the house to me. Emily gets nothing. I felt something shift in my chest, something quiet but certain, something that told me this was the moment everything would finally be spoken aloud. But the moment wasn't about the house. It wasn't about inheritance or money or fairness. It was about the years leading up to it, the years where silence was expected from me, where truth was a burden I was supposed to carry alone. And as I watched Jenna glow under the applause of relatives who didn't know they were cheering for a sinking ship, I realized that this was the night my silence would finally end. This was the night that the steady daughter, the responsible daughter, the overlooked daughter, would finally speak the truth that had been sitting in the center of our family long before any of us stepped into that dining room. And when I set my fork down and asked my father if I should tell them or whether he wanted to, that truth began its slow, inevitable rise to the surface, cracking through every illusion they had built around Jenna, every lie they had whispered to themselves, every shadow they had tucked me into for years. The house wasn't Jenna's victory. It was their confession. In the seconds after my question cut through the room, should I tell them or will you? I could almost feel the air change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of shift that happens when a long-standing script suddenly goes off track, when an actor forgets their line and the entire stage freezes because no one knows what to do next. My father sat motionless, staring at the table as though the answer might be hiding between the silverware and the folded napkin. Mom's breath caught in her throat, the kind of tiny sound people make when they see the first thread unravel. And Jenna. She stood there with her hand hovering over her wine glass, the triumphant smile she'd worn only moments earlier fading at the edges as if someone had quietly dimmed the light behind it. For the first time all night she looked unsure. Not embarrassed. Not guilty. Just unprepared. As if she had built an entire identity on the applause she expected, only to find herself suddenly performing in front of an audience that had forgotten its lines. The room didn't erupt with questions the way you might expect. Instead, it folded in on itself, becoming small and tight, like everyone had collectively sucked in a breath and forgotten how to let it out. My relatives, who had been clapping and cheering seconds earlier, sank into silence. Some exchanged glances. Others stared at their plates. A few leaned forward, unwilling to miss a moment of whatever was about to unfold. I didn't rush them. I didn't speak again right away. I simply let the tension settle the way dust settles in an abandoned room, soft but undeniable, until every eye found its way back to me. Because the truth is, there is power in stillness, especially in a family where the loudest voice always wins. I had spent my life speaking softly, carefully, only when asked. But tonight, my silence carried weight, and they all felt it. Dad finally cleared his throat. A small sound. Fragile. Emily, he began, but his voice cracked on my name, as though speaking it aloud reminded him of something he wished he hadn't forgotten. He looked older than I remembered. Tired shoulders slumped, lines etched deep around his eyes. It occurred to me then that secrets age people faster than time ever could. Jenna took a step forward. "Dad," she asked, her voice wavering for the first time. "What is she talking about?" Her tone was sharp around the edges, but underneath it was a fragile note, a crack in the confidence she wore like armor. Her gaze flicked between him and me, her confusion growing with each second he failed to answer. Mom jumped in before he could speak. She forced a brittle smile, the kind she used when pretending everything was fine. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," I said, not raising my voice but slicing through her sentence with quiet precision. "Since we're making announcements tonight." A few relatives shifted again, the discomfort growing thick enough to taste. My grandmother, sitting near the head of the table in her soft gray sweater, watched me with steady eyes, not surprised, not frightened, just present in a way only someone who has seen truth ignored for too long can be. Her expression didn't change, but something about her posture told me she had been waiting for this moment long before I realized it was coming. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and set the thick folder onto the table. It wasn't dramatic. No sharp slam, no theatrical reveal. Just paper meeting wood. But the sound carried through the room with the weight of everything that had been kept hidden. Dad's face drained of color. Mom's lips parted in a silent plea. Jenna stared at it as if I had placed a bomb between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce. "What is that?" she whispered. I didn't look at her. My eyes stayed on Dad, steady, unafraid, unblinking. "Tell them," I said quietly, "or I will." He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment I saw something that almost looked like regret flicker across his face. But it was gone too quickly, replaced by the hardened expression he used whenever he wanted to hide behind authority. "This isn't necessary," he muttered. "You're blowing things out of proportion." I opened the folder. The papers spread across the table like a deck of cards no one wanted to play. Overdue notices, payment schedules, copies of foreclosure warnings. And the page I slid forward last, the summary sheet with the total debt owed, bold as a confession carved in stone. Jenna stared at it, her breath catching. What is this?" "It's the house," I said softly. "The real version. Not the fairy tale version you were given." Mom pressed her hand to her chest. "Please, Emily, don't do this." "Don't do what?" I asked. "Don't tell the truth? Don't ruin the moment?" "The moment you ruined the second you told an entire room, I meant nothing to you." A few relatives gasped quietly, but no one spoke. No one defended my parents. The shift was palpable. A moment earlier, They had been cheering Jenna's inheritance like it was a coronation. Now they watched my parents with a new kind of scrutiny, one that made their shoulders tighten and their eyes dodge the table. Jenna's voice rose, the pitch cracking. Why would you show this? Why are you trying to embarrass them? I finally met her gaze. I'm not embarrassing them. I'm revealing what they asked me to sign 2 months ago. What they tried to make my responsibility. And when I refused, they turned to you. She blinked rapidly, mascara threatening to smudge. They wouldn't do that. Dad inhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a sigh and surrender. It's not what you think. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, I said. A house buried in debt. Payments behind. A foreclosure timeline already started. And a plan, your plan, to hand every bit of it to one of your daughters while pretending it was a gift. Jenna stumbled back into her chair, the strength draining from her legs. Her fiancé Tyler reached for her arm instinctively, only to pause halfway through, his expression shifting from concern to calculation. This was not the future he had been promised. And Jenna saw it. Saw the flicker of doubt, the hesitation. It hit her harder than my words. Mom finally broke. We were protecting you, she cried, her voice cracking. You have a good job, Emily. You could have helped. Jenna has always depended on us. She needs stability. Stability. I repeated, not cruelly, not loudly. Just honestly. How stable is it to hand someone a sinking ship and call it a blessing? No one spoke. Not even Jenna. The truth sat there pulsing between us. Truth about favoritism. About avoidance. About the quiet child who was expected to clean up messes she didn't make. About the golden child who was handed things without ever being taught what they cost. And in that heavy, painful silence, something inside me shifted. The years of swallowing frustration, of holding my breath to keep the peace, of being the responsible one, they didn't disappear. But they loosened. Just enough for me to speak the next words with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. You can call it love, I said softly. You can call it protection. You can call it whatever makes you sleep at night. But don't call it fairness. Don't call it family. And don't pretend this announcement was meant to celebrate Jenna. It was meant to hide the truth. My mother sobbed. Dad finally lowered his head. Jenna trembled. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the quiet daughter at the edge of the room. I felt like the only one willing to face the truth. And the truth had only begun to unravel. The moment the truth settled over the Thanksgiving table, it felt as though the entire house exhaled after years of holding its breath. The sound wasn't audible, but the change was so real I could feel it in my bones. The very walls which had witnessed every whispered lie, every subtle shift of favoritism, every moment I quietly stepped aside, seemed to stretch under the weight of something finally released. Yet in the middle of that release came something else, an ache deep and quiet, settling beneath my ribs like a bruise blooming behind the skin. Because even when justice begins to surface, the cost of reaching it has a way of carving itself into you. I didn't expect grief to arrive at the same time as truth, but it did, soft and heavy, like a reminder that even necessary endings leave shadows. Jenna sat hunched in her chair, her fingers trembling against the fabric of her dress. Just an hour earlier she had been glowing, confident, adored, the star of a moment she believed belonged to her. Now she looked deflated, like someone had poked a hole in the world she thought was solid. Her mascara had begun to smudge at the lower lash line, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold on to a version of reality she no longer recognized. It wasn't the debt alone that shattered her. It was the betrayal. The realization that the parents who swore they loved her equally had used her as a shield to hide their own collapse. And watching her crumble, I felt something unexpected. Pity, not for her privilege or her pride, but for the girl she truly was under all the applause. A girl who had never been asked to stand on her own. A girl who never learned to question what she was given. A girl who had no idea how fragile her life had been built. Tyler shifted away from her slightly, his jaw tightening as he stared at the papers scattered across the table. The future he believed he had secured through Jenna, free house, no mortgage, a financially stable start, had evaporated. I saw the calculation behind his eyes, the way he scanned the room, the way he tried to measure where this revelation left him. Jenna reached out, barely brushing his sleeve, but he instinctively pulled away, subtle but unmistakable. And the heartbreak that flashed across her face, That quiet pleading expression she tried to hide, struck something inside me. Not sympathy for their relationship, but recognition of that moment when someone's loyalty is tested and found thin. Dad finally lifted his head. His face flushed and strained, the weight of guilt pressing down on his shoulders until he seemed smaller than I'd ever seen him. "We didn't mean for this to happen tonight," he murmured, voice sounding worn. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone." But the words fell flat. Hollow. Even he didn't believe them. He rubbed a hand over his face and whispered, "We were desperate." And there it was, the word behind every lie, every half-truth, every unspoken expectation they'd piled onto me for years. Desperation. Not love. Not fairness. Not trust. Desperation. The kind that blinds you to the damage you cause. Mom reached toward him like she could piece the moment back together by sheer will, but her hand shook. "We thought we could fix it before anyone had to know," she said, her voice cracking. "We thought if Emily took responsibility, if she just signed, you girls would both be safe." She tried to smile through the tears, a trembling attempt to recast manipulation as protection. But there was no softening the truth now. The light had reached every corner. I could feel their eyes on me, my parents, my sister, the relatives, even my grandmother, and for the first time I wasn't seeing expectation in them. I was seeing something different. Fear, yes. Shame, absolutely. But beneath that, something else. Recognition. The understanding that the daughter they thought would always stay silent had finally stopped carrying their weight. And the loss of that illusion scared them more than the debt itself. I stood up from my chair, not abruptly, not dramatically, just quietly, with a steadiness that centered the room. My legs felt heavy but not weak. There's a particular strength that comes with telling the truth after years of being conditioned to suppress it. A strength that feels both unfamiliar and deeply natural. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I didn't blame them. I simply spoke what needed to be spoken. "I'm not your safety net," I said softly. "I never should have been." The words hung in the air long after they left my mouth. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing before him, like I had grown into someone he'd never taken the time to see. Mom reached for me, tears forming, but I stepped back before her fingers could brush my sleeve. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. Out of understanding that for the first time, I needed distance more than I needed to be understood. "I can't fix this," I continued. "And I won't be the person you sacrificed to hide the consequences of secrets you chose to keep." Jenna's lower lip trembled. "Emily, I didn't know." "I know," I whispered, meeting her eyes. "You were never supposed to know." She looked down at her hands, shoulders folding inward as the weight of her parents' choices finally settled onto her. And for the first time in years there was no jealousy between us, no resentment, no competition. Just two sisters standing in the wreckage of a family neither of us had built. A quiet clink broke through the tension as my grandmother set her fork down. She straightened in her chair, her silver hair catching the soft glow of the chandelier. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of someone who had watched every generation repeat the same mistakes. "You should be ashamed," she said to my parents. "Both of you." The room seemed to tilt toward her words. Even the candles flickered in a way that made the moment feel almost sacred. Children are not escape routes. They're not debt holders. They're not shields for your bad decisions. Dad bowed his head. Mom sobbed quietly. Jenna curled in on herself. And in that moment, the weight of our family's history, the years of favoritism and excuses, the unbalanced expectations, it all cracked like a mirror struck by a stone. I excused myself from the table, stepping away from the tension, the regret, the unraveling. In the hallway, the world felt strangely still. The hum of the heating vents filled the quiet, a subtle reminder of stability, warmth continuing even when the people around it began to fracture. I pressed my back against the wall and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. And in that breath was grief for the family I had always hoped we could be, and acceptance of the family we actually were. But beneath the grief was something else. Something steadier. A spark of resolve I hadn't felt in years. The beginning of a line I hadn't crossed yet but was inching toward with every truth spoken. Because every fall carries the seed of a rise. Every moment of quiet isolation gives birth to clarity. And as I stood there, listening to the muted murmurs of a family unraveling behind closed doors, I realized this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of me. In the days after Thanksgiving, the house I had grown up in, once a place filled with noise, expectations, and carefully curated images of family unity, became something else entirely. It became a battlefield after the smoke cleared. Everyone was walking through the ruins of the truth I had laid bare, each one trying to figure out where to stand now that the ground they'd relied on had cracked beneath them. Mom left voicemails in a trembling voice, switching between apologies and guilt-laced pleas for me to understand the pressure they were under. Dad sent 2 emails that read more like formal statements than attempts to repair a family. Jenna, she texted once, a single line that said, "I don't know what to do now," followed by hours of silence. And as all 3 of them tried to gather the pieces of a story that had long been held together with habit and denial, I found myself settling into something I had never known before. Peace. Not loud, triumphant peace. Not the kind that announces itself with a victory march. This was quiet peace, the kind that seeps into the corners of your life like warm light at dawn, steady and patient. The kind you don't brag about because it only grows in silence. I returned to Chicago with a stillness in my chest that felt foreign, almost suspicious at first. I kept waiting for the guilt to come rushing back like it always had, the pull to fix things, to soothe them, to carry what wasn't mine. But it didn't return. The threads that had tied me to their crises for years had loosened, then snapped. And without them tugging at me, I began to realize just how heavy that burden had been. My small apartment suddenly felt like a sanctuary. The hum of city traffic drifting through the window, the kettle whistling in the kitchen, the soft click of my heater turning on. These simple sounds became markers of a life that was finally my own. But peace doesn't erase truth. It gives you the space to face it. And as I settled into my own rhythms again, I finally began piecing together the deeper story behind what my parents had tried to do. Their debt wasn't new. Their desperation wasn't sudden. It had been building for years. Quiet red flags I hadn't seen because I had never been meant to see them. Missed calls that weren't a big deal. Odd hesitations when money came up. My father's short temper when conversations drifted toward anything financial. They had crafted a narrative in which they were stable parents. Responsible. Proud. The kind who raised one daughter to shine and another to stay dependable enough to lean on. And when that narrative began to crumble, they didn't choose honesty. They chose illusion. Jenna's inheritance announcement had never been about passing down a legacy. It had been about passing down a burden. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Sad in the quiet, lingering way that sits behind your heart and resurfaces when you least expect it. Sad because I had spent most of my life believing that responsibility equaled love. That if I gave enough, carried enough, stayed silent enough, maybe someday they would see me the way they saw her. But families built on uneven scaffolding always collapse eventually. And ours had finally reached its breaking point. A week after the dinner, I received a call from my grandmother. She didn't waste time on small talk. "You did the right thing," she said simply. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between truth and betrayal. "I didn't do it to be right," I told her quietly. "I did it because I couldn't keep carrying what wasn't mine." She hummed softly, like she understood something I hadn't said aloud. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who finally put down what was never made for them. That sentence echoed with me long after we hung up. But the moment everything truly shifted happened 2 days later. I was at my desk, deep in spreadsheets and case notes from work, when a number I didn't recognize flashed across my phone. I almost ignored it. But something nudged me to answer. A woman introduced herself in a calm, level voice. She said she was calling from the mortgage investigation unit. She had some follow-up questions. I straightened in my chair, the memory of her walking into my parents' home the night of Thanksgiving still vivid in my mind. Her plain suit, her badge, her steady presence slicing through the chaos of that dining room. She asked if I could confirm a few details. The date my parents had approached me, the documents they had asked me to sign, the sequence of events leading up to the holiday. I answered carefully but honestly. She thanked me, then paused. "You should know," she said quietly, "that your refusal may have saved them from digging a deeper hole." I swallowed hard. I wasn't trying to get them in trouble. "I know," she replied. "But deception doesn't disappear just because someone means well." After the call ended, I stared at my phone for a long time. It hit me then. The gravity of what had been happening behind the scenes, the layers of desperation my parents had tried to patch with secrecy. And for the first time since everything unfolded, I let myself feel the weight of it, not out of guilt, but out of empathy for the people who had cracked under pressures they were too prideful to name. Didn't excuse them. It didn't soften the betrayal, but it humanized it. A few days later, Jenna showed up at my door. It was early evening. A drizzle coated the city in a soft haze. She stood in the hallway with her coat still on, her hair slightly damp, her expression stripped of every trace of pride or entitlement. She looked small, younger than I remembered, and fragile in a way she didn't try to hide anymore. When I opened the door, she didn't speak. She just stepped inside quietly and sat on my couch like she had done it 1,000 times, even though she never had. For a long time, neither of us said anything. She ran her fingers along the stitching of a cushion, her breath shallow, uneven. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Tyler broke things off." She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She just stated it like a fact she still couldn't fully touch. "I'm sorry," I said softly, meaning it. She nodded slowly. "He said he needed stability. Security." Her voice hitched slightly. "He said the house was too big of a risk." I watched her swallow hard. I didn't even know what he meant at first. I didn't understand anything. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and the shame on her face wasn't directed at being left. It was directed at the realization that she had been living in a world carefully constructed by Mom and Dad. A world where she was sheltered from every storm until it finally broke over her without warning. "I thought they were protecting me," she whispered. "All this time I thought I was the lucky one." "You were the favored one," I said gently. "That's not the same thing." She closed her eyes as if the truth stung. "You should hate me." "I don't," I said honestly. "I don't think you ever had a chance to understand what was happening." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, not spilling over, but clinging there like they weren't sure if they belonged. "I want to fix this," she said. "I don't know how, but I don't want to lose you too." Something in my chest softened. Not in a forgiving way, not in a naive way, but in a human way. Jenna wasn't the villain. She was the product of a system built long before either of us had the words to question it. And now, for the first time, she was trying to see beyond it. "We don't fix the past," I told her gently. "We learn from it. And we do better moving forward." Her shoulders sagged in relief. She nodded, wiping a tear before it could fall. For the first time in years, we weren't standing on opposite ends of a family script. We were standing side by side, two women trying to reclaim the pieces of themselves that had once been shaped by everyone but them. After she left, the apartment felt even quieter than before, but in a good way, in a peaceful way. I made myself tea, stood by the window, and watched the city lights flicker across the wet pavement. And for the first time since I was a child sitting beside my grandmother, I felt seen. Not by my family, but by myself. This wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. The kind that arrives after you stop running from the truth and finally let it reshape your life. And as I stood there watching the soft glow of city lights, I realized something quietly profound. Truth had set me apart, but it had also set me free. In the weeks that followed Jenna's visit, the air around my life settled into a stillness that felt almost unreal. The kind that arrives only after a storm that took years to build and just a single night to break. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows disaster. It was the quiet that comes with understanding, with the slow rearrangement of pieces that were never placed correctly to begin with. Chicago moved around me with its usual rhythm, people rushing across crosswalks, trains humming across tracks, the smell of roasted coffee drifting through the air as winter crept closer. But inside my apartment, a different kind of season was unfolding, one marked not by cold or heat, but by the steady warming of a life finally reclaimed. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for the next call, the next crisis, the next expectation disguised as duty. There was space where weight used to sit, room where guilt once lived, and a kind of unfolding peace that didn't feel borrowed or fragile. It felt earned. My parents stayed quiet for almost 10 days, which surprised me less than it should have. They weren't used to being confronted, especially not in front of an audience they'd spent years trying to impress. And though part of me wondered whether they were avoiding me out of shame or waiting for me to reach out in the same responsible way I always had, I didn't allow myself to fill in the silence on their behalf. Instead, I gave myself the thing we'd never had before: boundaries. Hard ones. Ones that didn't bend just because someone else was uncomfortable. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't make declarations. I simply let space exist. And in that space, I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to fully admit. Love is not measured by how much you're willing to lose for someone. It's measured by how honestly you're willing to live beside them. When my father finally called, the conversation began with a long pause, the kind that speaks louder than words. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound defensive. He sounded tired, stripped of the performance he carried into every family gathering. "Emily," he said finally, "I don't know how to fix what we've done." I listened without interrupting. It was the first time I'd ever heard him admit the limits of his own control. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he continued, voice rough around the edges. We thought if we could just get through a little longer, maybe something would change." I closed my eyes, letting his words settle. "You should have told us," I said softly. "You should have told me." He exhaled shakily. "I know." Another pause. "We weren't trying to punish you. We just didn't know who else to lean on." There it was, the truth beneath the truth. They had leaned on me not because they believed in my strength, but because they had been conditioned to believe it was mine to carry. I softened my tone, not out of forgiveness but clarity. "I'm not angry at you for being overwhelmed," I said. "I'm angry because you tried to hide it. And because you tried to pass it to Jenna and call it a gift." He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. Instead, he whispered, "You're right," in a way that sounded like it hurt him and relieved him at the same time. Mom called the next morning. She cried more than she spoke, her emotions spilling out in fragments of apologies and explanations that contradicted themselves. "I didn't want to lose you," she said at one point, "but I didn't know how to keep everything from falling apart." She admitted things she'd never said aloud before. Not just about the debt, but about the fear, the pride, the pressure she had placed on herself to maintain an image that never really existed. I didn't try to fix her the way I once would have. Instead, I gave her the truth she needed, not the comfort she expected. "I love you," I said gently, "but I can't carry the parts of your life you refuse to face. If we're going to build a real relationship, it has to start with honesty, not expectation." She cried harder at that, but not in a wounded way. More in a relieved way. Like she had finally been told the truth she was too afraid to ask for. As winter settled over the city, Jenna and I began rebuilding something that resembled a relationship. Not the kind plastered across holiday cards. Not the forced sisterhood my parents had curated, but something more fragile and more authentic. Some days she called to talk through her pain, her confusion, the pieces of herself she was only just beginning to understand. Other days she simply called to sit in silence on the phone, the way we used to do when we were little girls whispering under blankets. She didn't ask me to fix anything for her. She didn't ask me to intervene with our parents. She simply wanted connection, the real kind, not the one wrapped in competition or performance. And slowly I found myself wanting it too. The house went on the market within a month. When Dad told me, his voice carried a mixture of grief and acceptance, like he was letting go of something that had defined him for too long. "It feels strange," he admitted, "but maybe it's time." I didn't disagree. The house had held too many unspoken things, too many shadows passed down through habit rather than intention. Letting it go wasn't just about money. It was about ending a story that should have ended long before any of us realized it was hurting us. One snowy afternoon I walked along Lake Michigan, the wind tugging gently at my coat. The world felt soft and muted, the edges of the city blurred by falling snow. As I stood near the water, I thought about the girl I had been, the girl who believed her worth was measured by how much she could endure. The girl who sat at the edge of the table, quiet and steady. The girl who thought she had to earn her place in a family that had never truly seen her. And I felt a tender kind of sadness for her, but also a profound gratitude. Because she had gotten me here. To this moment, to this clarity, to this quiet glow settling beneath my skin. Healing didn't arrive in a single moment. It arrived in small ones. The first night I slept without replaying the Thanksgiving dinner in my head. The morning I made coffee and didn't brace for a phone call. The moment I laughed, really laughed, at something silly Jenna texted. The afternoon my grandmother sent me a handwritten note that said simply, "I'm proud of you." The way those 4 words warmed me in a place nothing else had touched for years. The truth is, the glow didn't come from winning anything. It didn't come from exposing anyone. It came from finally stepping into a life shaped by my own choices, not by the expectations others placed on me. It came from choosing honesty over silence, boundaries over guilt, self-respect over sacrifice. Came from letting go. On New Year's Eve, I lit a single candle on my coffee table. No countdown, no party, no noise. Just a quiet moment in a quiet apartment with the soft hum of the city outside my window. As the flame flickered, I thought about everything that had happened, everything that had ended, everything that was just beginning. And in that soft, warm glow, I realized something I had never understood before. Revenge doesn't always look like a fire. Sometimes it looks like light. A light you walk toward step by step until you finally see yourself clearly. And I did. I saw a woman who had learned to speak after years of being muted. A woman who stepped out of the shadows not to hurt anyone, but to heal herself. A woman who chose truth, not to break her family, but to free herself from its unspoken weight. As the candle burned lower, I whispered softly into the quiet room, not for anyone else to hear, but for myself alone. I'm ready now. Ready for the next chapter. Ready for a life that belonged to me. Ready for peace. Not the kind handed to me by others, but the kind I had built piece by piece, truth by truth. And as the flame steadied, so did I. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands quiet strength. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the courage to begin again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your stories matter here.